Okay, so let's continue with this. So the next part is how does the nervous system process information? First of all, you will need to know what's a reflex action. So a reflex action is this immediate response to a specific stimulus without any conscious control. So this in a way is something very involuntary and it's not under the control of the person's will. So the pathway, the shortest pathway of the nervous impulses from the receptor to the effector is known as a reflex arc. Do take note that reflex action is different from the reflex arc, where reflex arc meant the pathway, whereas the reflex action is actually the response leading to the involuntary action. This is a common definition asked during examinations. So we'll be understanding maybe two to three types of reflex action that you will need to know. These are the ones that commonly comes out in exam where you are required to explain them. So the first one is touching a hot object. So first of all, the heat will stimulate the receptors in your skin and the nervous impulses are produced and they are then transmitted along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. Following this, in the spinal cord, the nerve impulses are then transmitted to the relay neuron and following this to the motor neuron, while at the same time, the nerve impulses are also transmitted to the brain. Finally, upon receiving the nervous impulses from the relay neuron, the motor neuron will transmit nerve impulses to the effector. The effector muscles will contract, leading to a withdrawal of the hand from the hot object. So what will happen is you would see that number one, we have your stimulus, which is the heat, detected by the hands organs, the skin. Following this, you'll be sent to the sensory neuron, followed by the relay neuron, and of course to the brain for deciphering or not. If it's not going to be transmitted to the brain, then it will move to the motor neuron. And after the motor neuron, then it will lead to the final one, which is the effector, which is the muscle for the response. So these are some of the key words that you need to write in your exams for the different stages in order to get the marks. So the reflex arc is this shortest pathway in which the nerve impulses transmitted from the receptor to the effector in a reflex action. And most of the time, this doesn't even need to actually enter into the brain. The signal doesn't even have to enter into the brain. So what will happen is receptors will lead to the sensory neuron, to the relay neuron, to the motor neuron, and finally to the effector. So because of the lack of transmission to the brain, therefore, it becomes an involuntary action. The types of the reflex action really depends on the location of where you exhibit or response or detect the stimulus. If it's at the bottom part of your body, onwards it will be your spinal cord reflex, where these reflexes are controlled by the spinal cord. For example, the withdrawal reflexes or your knee jerk reflexes, where you hit a hammer to your knee, then your leg will jerk. The other one is a cranial reflex, which are generally responses that are or stimulus that will take place above your body, upper body. So these reflexes are usually controlled by the brain, but occur without a person's consciousness. For example, pupil reflex, your eye, the size of the opening and closing of the pupil, which we will go through in the next chapter, or salivation, where your body will actually secrete saliva. So for the spinal reflex, the next one we talk about is actually the knee jerk reflex, where we can see for the first one, right, through the stimulus, the tendon under the kneecap is being tapped upon, in which the nervous impulse are then sent to the spinal cord by the sensory neuron. This information is then passed on from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron and subsequently to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron will then send these impulses to your thigh muscles, which are your effector. Lastly, a response will happen when the muscles will contract and cause the lower knee to jerk upwards or extend outwards. The next one is we call the cranial reflex, which is the third reflex action, is the pupil reflex. So for example, in bright light, the eye pupil will constrict to reduce the amount of light entering your eye so that you don't actually get over light intensity to actually damage your sensory neurons. And in dim light, the eye pupil will actually dilate meaning will become bigger to increase the amount of light entering the eye so that you can see more clearly. So generally that's the end of the different kinds of pupil reflex action, the different kinds of reflex action, and then we will move on to the next chapter in another time. Thank you.